people are coming into the room, we're going to give people about a minute or two before we start, because we all know as librarians, we get caught with patrons, we're at the desk. So just hang with us for a minute, please. Okay, it looks like people coming into the webinar has slowed down. So we're going to go ahead and get started because we only have an hour today. So welcome to the ALA Office of Diversity, Literacy, Outreach Services, or called ODLOS, and the ALA Social Responsibilities Roundtable. We call ourselves SRRT. This is our fourth afternoon of social justice. My name is April Sheppard. I am the past coordinator of SRRT. I'm also a member of the SRRT Programming Committee, so we have put together this whole event today. As you come in, you'll notice that your microphone has been muted. Please keep it that way. And as with any other presentation, you can have turn on captions there at the bottom corner. There's also a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please ask your questions in the Q&A. That way we can make sure we get to them at the end of the presentation. And then feel free to talk amongst yourself in the chat. Now I have the honor of introducing our speakers for our second session of today. Disability is not a bad word. Our speakers are Quirin Manwiller. She's the education librarian at Westchester University, and Brea McQueen. She's the student success librarian at the Miami University Hamilton. Take it away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Disability is Not a Bad Word, accessible language for inclusive libraries. We'd like to thank April and the entire ALA Social Responsibility Roundtable for inviting us to speak to you all. Today, we will learn appropriate and preferred terms to use in reference to people with disabilities. We appreciate you taking time during your workday to focus on disability inclusion, which is often left out of equity discussions in the library world. We will have a discussion period later on, but feel free to post your questions like April said. Our slides with script and our resources handout will be made available through a link to a Google folder. My name is, like April introduced me, is Quirin Manwiller. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the education librarian at Westchester University. I'm currently on maternity leave. I am also chronically ill and dynamically disabled. I live with a number of illnesses, primarily hypermobility Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, despite appearing perfectly healthy to most people. My disability impacts my experience in libraries as an employee and a patron, as well as an advocate for LIS workers with disabilities. My scholarship centers on disability inclusion, and I'm currently pursuing a second master's degree focused on strategic disability inclusion in higher education. You can reach me via email, or I'm still on Twitter, at least for the very near future. I expect that to change, but email will get to me as well.
Hello all, so my name is Brea McQueen. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the student success librarian at Miami University Hamilton. I am also an invisibly and dynamically disabled librarian. I have spent the majority of my career working in public libraries, but have recently switched to academic libraries. So I'm super excited to be here today, and I encourage anyone to reach out via Twitter for now. That's where I am most active for now, and to have further conversations about LIS and disabilities. So our goals for today are centered around breaking down cultural ableism through improved language. You will understand the importance of using the word disability to refer to people in the disability community, identify appropriate and inappropriate language surrounding disability, and improve the inclusivity of your library's culture for both patrons and LIS workers by adopting anti-ableist approaches to language. So to start, I want to explain why language is so important to inclusion and accessibility for disabled folks. Actual inclusion for people with disabilities is more than having a wheelchair accessible building, making sure your website is screen readable, or having a diversity statement. It's about fundamentally reviewing the culture in your library or archive to see if it is an equitable workplace for all employees and inclusive of patrons and staff. And a large part of daily culture experienced by staff and patron is the language used in our programming, resources, and by library personnel. Regardless of intention, language indicates the reality or lack of inclusion in the library. When disabled folks see their lived experiences discussed with outdated or hurtful terms, it makes them feel unsafe in that environment, whether as a patron utilizing our services or an employee unable to disclose their disability openly. The fear of discrimination, judgment, or simply not being believed prevents many disabled people from seeking necessary assistance to make their jobs or experiences in the library accessible. We can build a more equitable and inclusive library culture by adopting accessible language into our everyday work, removing harmful language, and learning more about the barriers that exist for people with disabilities.
The first step to using inclusive language is to actually use the word disability. Despite a pervasive assumption in American society, the word disability is not inherently bad because being disabled is not inherently bad. In fact, it's a pretty normal part of human existence. According to the CDC, 26% of American adults live with disability in some form, making it one of the largest marginalized groups in the country. In addition, COVID-19 is considered a mass disabling event, with 1 in 5 US adults reporting a long COVID disabling event after an infection. This term, disability, is actually a legal term, and it's essential to the civil rights of this group. It is what is used in our laws that protect people with disabilities, including the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which was the first law that protected the civil rights of people with disabilities in the United States, the Americans with Disability Act, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which oversees special education in public schools. When we refuse to use the terminology in those laws, we are removing the disabled person or persons from the group being legally protected. In addition, disability was the term used by prominent groups during the disability rights movement of the late 20th century. This includes the American Coalition of the Citizens with Disabilities, who staged successful 10 city sit-ins in 1977 to force the federal government to issue rules to carry out the civil rights protections in the Rehabilitation Act, and the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, who worked on civil rights legislation and Supreme Court cases before playing a major role in advocating for the ADA. By using the word disability, we recognize the generations of disability rights activists who fought for the inclusion and protection guaranteed under these civil rights laws. Therefore, it's important to acknowledge the legal definition of disability because it's what guides these laws and disability inclusion in public spaces. From the ADA National Network, the ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. This includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. The ADA Amendments Act of 2008 emphasizes that this definition should be interpreted in the broadest terms possible. This encompasses physical impairments that impact areas of the body such as the neurological, musculoskeletal, immune, digestive, endocrine systems, and any mental or cognitive disorder like intellectual disabilities, learning disorders, and mental illness. In the library world and much of American society, we view disability in very limited terms and often think it includes wheelchair users, deaf or hard of hearing folks, and blind individuals. But the legal protection goes far beyond this cultural assumption to include asthma, cancer, diabetes, epilepsy, heart disease, migraines, complications from pregnancy, thyroid gland disorders, and more. Despite the stereotype of disability that is pervasive in our culture, disability in reality is far more common and often not visibly apparent. I want to stress again that this is a legal definition used to ensure equal rights and may not necessarily match with a person's individual choice to identify as disabled. A person may meet these qualifications, having an impairment that limits one or more major life activity, and not identify it as disabled or feel they're impaired enough to be considered disabled. Self-identification is a very complex issue within the field of disability studies, and I welcome you to look into it further if it interests you. Personally, it took me a long time to accept disability as my new reality once my chronic illnesses became impairing to that degree. This was in large part because I had such a limited understanding of what disability meant and thought it equated to a complete lack of functioning. However, what I came to understand and what I hope you will leave this session understanding is that disability equals a wide range of functionality and life experiences that we must actively work to include in our libraries. Disability, however, is more complex in reality than a legal definition appears because it does not exist in a silo, and experiences vary greatly depending on the way disability intersects with other marginalized identities. In fact, disability is also more prevalent among people experiencing other forms of marginalization. The CDC reports that 2 in 5 Native Americans and Alaskans live with disability, as do 1 in 4 women. Sins Invalid, a performance group of queer disabled people of color, has been foundational in developing the concept of disability justice, which builds on the work of the disability rights movement to address the intersectional oppression experienced by multi-marginalized people. This is primarily because ableism is an inherent part of white supremacy. In their explanation of disability justice, adapted from Patty Byrne, Sins Invalid write, quote, "The history of white supremacy and ableism are inextricably entwined, created in the context of colonial conquest and capitalist domination. One cannot look at the history of U.S. slavery, the stealing of indigenous lands, and U.S. imperialism without seeing the way white supremacy uses ableism to create a lesser or other group of people that is deemed less worthy, abled, smart, or capable. A single issue civil rights framework is not enough to explain the full extent of ableism and how it operates in our society. We can only truly understand ableism by tracing its connections to heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism," end quote. Within libraries, disability often gets regulated to ADA compliance, accessibility efforts, and not woven through equity, diversity, and inclusion work. But we cannot equitably account for disabled experiences without acknowledging the complex identities that contribute to inclusion in our profession. Disability intersects with a person's race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and age, all of which impacts the way an individual experiences ableism in the workplace and our larger society. To be an inclusive and accessible profession, we must address the barriers that exist for people with disabilities through complex EDI efforts that also address the needs of other underrepresented groups. So people with disabilities make up a quarter of the adult population, and a wide range of illnesses and impairments are considered disabilities. Why do we use euphemisms in place of the word disability? To explain this, I want to share some historical context. This comes from the book Enforcing Normalcy, Disability, Deafness, and the Body by Leonard Davis, which I highly recommend. A big reason we have culturally accepted disability as something bad and therefore not to be talked about is because of the creation of a normal as a concept. Prior to the 18th and 19th centuries, the ideal body in European cultures existed in mythology and art, using the best parts of human models to create an ideal, like the Birth of Venus painting. This ideal form of the body was understood as something unattainable for humans, and therefore not something people needed to conform to. The idea of a norm to aspire to came about primarily in the 1800s, when the rise of modern statistics as a field coincided with the rise of eugenics. Statisticians applied the idea of a normal distribution or bell curve to humans, meaning there was a normal or average man. Unlike the ideal, the norm became something that the majority of the population was expected to fit into. And as an average man developed, deviations of that norm, often disabilities, became more apparent. Statisticians, especially in England and the wider eugenics movement, sought to remove these deviations from the population, and disabled people became relegated to a defective class that needed to be eliminated. It is also worth noting that at the same time, the Industrial Revolution was changing work from trade and agrarian to factory labor. The creation of an average worker for these factories further left out people with disabilities who did not adapt as well to the new workplace normal. As a result of these movements, we to this day have an understanding of a normal body to aspire to, with abnormal or disabled bodies considered defective. Which brings us to ableism, or the set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities. and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or the other. This form of discrimination seeks to fit disabled bodies into the norm and devalue them if that's not possible. Ableism shows up through our language in a variety of ways, including when we do not speak of disability as the normal human experience that it is. Brea, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry. So to address the commonplace ableism that is pervasive in our culture, I want to first address how we should refer to people with disabilities. There we go. So there are two main approaches to identifying people with disabilities. The first is called person-first language, and it is where you list the disability after the person. So person with disabilities, librarian with chronic illness, etc. This purposefully separates the individual from the disability to signify the person is more than their disability or not defined by it. It sees disability as something a person has and not something a person is. It is considered the current politically correct term, and it is what is used in the ADA and the IDEA. The goal of person-first language is to emphasize the dignity of people with disabilities by acknowledging that they are first and foremost a person. It also seeks to eliminate generalizations or stereotypes about people with disabilities by recognizing the individual person over broad terms like the disabled. The other approach is identity first, where you list the disability as an adjective, like disabled person. This indicates that the disability is central to the person's identity and is increasingly preferred by actual disabled people themselves. You'll notice that I've used disabled and described myself as disabled throughout this presentation. Again, this is used as an adjective, not a noun, as in the disabled. I am personally comfortable with either, but prefer identity first language. I do not think disability needs to be separated from my identity because it is not something to be ashamed of. The reality is it does define much of my life, whether because of my physical limitations or through my activism work, and that's okay. In addition to personal choice, identity first language is preferred by culturally distinctive groups like deaf and hard of hearing folks and the autistic and neurodivergent communities who feel like using identity first language recognizes the value of the whole individual. So in practice, it's best to defer to the individual person's preference where possible. Some people with disabilities are okay with either, while others very strongly identify with only one. Beyond the individual, use identity first for communities where it is the standard and first person if you are unsure. As a good rule of thumb, do not correct others on their personal use of person versus identity first language, particularly if you're non-disabled yourself. It can be a very personal and complex decision for individuals with disabilities to choose how to identify and should be their choice. Now that we've discussed what language to use when discussing people with disabilities, I'll explain what needs to be avoided. The first, as we've already mentioned, are euphemisms for the word disability or disabled. This includes things like handicapped, handicapable, differently abled, etc. These terms are generally not created by disabled people, and as we've mentioned previously, separate them from the language protecting their civil rights. In addition, not using the appropriate language implies there's something wrong with being disabled. I want to specifically highlight special needs as a term not to use because I see it used a lot in library spaces. A misconception about special needs is that it's tied to special education. While I might not love the term special education, it is the terminology used in IDEA, and therefore we need to use that in practice. Special needs, however, is not in IDEA, which uses students with disabilities or students qualifying for special education. Like the other euphemisms, this term was created by non-disabled people and in practice is very frustrating for actual disabled people because there is nothing special about our needs. We have the same basic human needs as non-disabled people: shelter, sustenance, comfort, support, and just may have different ways of meeting those needs. Overall, these terms tend to be infantilizing and dismissive, othering disabled people more than they already are. With that said, I do want to re-emphasize the importance of allowing people to self-identify. So in the book, Demystifying Disability, Emily Liddell gives the example of the activist Kayla McQueen, who has Down syndrome and refers to herself as differently abled. While on the whole, it would not be acceptable to use this language to refer to all disabled people, it is incredibly important to respect the language people have chosen for themselves. So the next form of inappropriate language is colloquial or cultural incidents of ableism. The most common is using disability to exaggerate a point or as a stereotype. Things like calling someone moody bipolar, someone who may be socially awkward autistic, or referring to organizational skills as OCD. This extends beyond the specific conditions to include words like crazy, insane, lame, dumb to describe a person or incident. The casual use of actual disabilities minimizes the experience of real people into a joke. Another example of common ableism in our language is the way we talk about mobility or other accessibility aids as being restrictive, indicating a person is restricted by their disability. A good example of this is saying wheelchair bound, which implies users are constrained to a device that actually allows more freedom of movement. Many wheelchair users are ambulatory and use wheelchairs when they need mobility assistance. These accessibility aids allow for greater independence, not constraint. Overall, try not to use language that implies the disability or accessibility need is inherently negative. And lastly, do not refer to disability as a challenge to overcome or use terms like suffering, as in she suffers from a chronic illness. Remember that disability is a normal part of life and does not need to be treated like a burden. And so the last form of inappropriate language I'll mention is inspiration porn, a term coined by disability rights activist Stella Young. So inspiration porn is when disabled people are called inspirational by non-disabled people solely or in part because they are living their life with a disability. These often take the form of viral videos or memes and include people with intellectual or visible physical disabilities. This form of discussion about disabled people is used to motivate able-bodied people. The idea is that if a disabled person can accomplish something, then of course an able-bodied person can. An example would be a disabled child partaking in a normal activity like playing with a sport or succeeding in school with captions like, "Your excuse is invalid." It implies disabled people's normal activities should somehow be considered extraordinary simply because they are disabled. Often accompanying inspiration porn is language about people overcoming their disability to accomplish something instead of simply accomplishing something while disabled. This form of inappropriate language does not celebrate disabled people, but in fact helps non-disabled people celebrate that they are not disabled.
While the examples we have given are a good rule of thumb, I do want to acknowledge that terms change over time, and you will not always know what is preferred by people with disabilities. I also want to note that many terms related to disability are legal or medical and may do more harm than good to individual experience, especially when seeking things like diagnosis or accommodations. To that end, I want to remind you of this slogan from the disability rights movement: "Nothing about us without us." This phrase became a rallying cry during the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and asserts that people with disabilities know what is best for them. It represents the need to include actual disabled people in policymaking and representation across culture. Remember this phrase if you ever are unsure if your language or programming is inappropriate. Center actual disabled people as opposed to parents of people with disabilities, for example. Defer to disabled people and their preferences. Lastly, I want to touch on some other disability terms to know. One of the most common recommended ways to create an inclusive culture for people with disabilities is for more people in the workplace to learn about disability. When more of our library staff understand the experience of people with disabilities and the language fundamental to that experience, they can better adapt their culture to be inclusive of accessibility needs. The first term that you may have heard before is accommodations. I want to spend some time on workplace accommodations instead of classroom accommodations because it is most likely what librarians will encounter in a library for themselves or their coworkers. It's important to understand the terminology used in this process and the purpose behind it to provide an inclusive workplace for those who may need accommodations. The term and process comes from the American with Disabilities Act and is the tool used to provide equal access to employment for people with disabilities. The goal of accommodations is to adjust the hiring process or a person's job duties or workplace environment to provide the disabled person with an equal opportunity to succeed. This process looks like a person's doctor providing a letter stating specific accommodation is requested for a medical condition. For example, I've requested a chair with neck support. I have one here. Then Human Resources reviews the request and determines if it is reasonable, a key distinction within this process. Reasonable means the request does not put an undue burden on the workplace financially or otherwise, and does not fundamentally change the position description. This means not all requests are actually fulfilled or fulfilled in the way the doctor suggests. Workplaces are able to implement alternative accommodations if they feel it would be more reasonable for the workplace. The accommodations process should help close the employment gap for people with disabilities. In 2022, only 21.3% of disabled people were employed, which has been rising in the last few years. But in reality, accommodations are very difficult to navigate and succeed in receiving. A 2019 disability supplement to the Department of Labor's current population survey found that only 15.4% of people with disabilities surveyed sought accommodations. Many people, including those with disabilities, are unfamiliar with the process as a whole and might not know what to ask for or if they even qualify for the assistance. That's why discussing the language around this legal process is important for all library workers if we want to create an inclusive library culture. It allows disabled workers to understand their rights and ensure non-disabled library workers that know that accommodations are not special treatment, but a process necessary for an accessible library. There are a few other disability-related terms I want to mention in order to help you fully understand the diversity of experience among disabled folks. The first is disclosure, which means explaining a disability to others. For many people, disability needs to be explained because it's not visibly apparent. This means you can't necessarily tell by looking at someone that they are disabled. This includes deaf and hard of hearing folks and most chronically ill individuals. I look perfectly healthy to those unfamiliar with my illnesses. Non-apparent or invisible disabilities contrast from our social assumptions about disability, so people often fear they will not be believed if they disclose, or will face some sort of retribution. This makes disclosure a deeply personal experience and one that generally occurs through close personal relationships or when required for accommodations. Human Resources can request confirmation of a diagnosis for accommodations, but beyond that, it's up to the individual person who they want to disclose to, how they want to disclose, and what they choose to disclose. This is a key reason accessible language is important regardless of the situation in libraries. There could very likely be a patron or library worker present who has not chosen to disclose and is not visibly disabled. They deserve an inclusive culture too. Lastly, I also want to mention the term dynamically disabled, which I used to describe myself and was coined by Brea in 2019. Dynamic disabilities are ones that fluctuate in severity over time. They are often chronic illnesses that are not stagnant, but can change in impairment from day to month to year. Overall, these terms challenge our commonly held belief on what a disability is, but are the reality for many disabled people. Finally, I want to caution you about the language we use around disability inclusion in libraries. While accessibility is clearly something we need to work on, just adding the term to DEI efforts does not recognize the complexity of the disabled experience. As shown throughout LIS literature on accessibility, libraries have a very basic idea of what accessibility means, and it's usually barely meeting ADA compliance. As Dr. K.T. Vaughn has described, the ADA is the floor, and actual accessibility is the ceiling. I worry that when libraries and archives add the A, they are continuing to address accessibility by doing the base legally allowed and then checking a box when they're successful at the bare minimum. Beyond our profession's current flawed understanding of accessibility, disability should inherently be a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. When we regulate it to its own letter, we ignore the ways disability intersects with other marginalized identities, and the fact that accessibility is not necessarily the same as equity. While recognizing disability in equity work is a step forward in libraries, it must be done with intention to move beyond the legal requirements to inclusion. Don't just have an accessibility policy or clause. Make sure disability is fully incorporated in all your DEI efforts. To conclude today, I want to reiterate that anti-ableist language that incorporates preferred disability terms and identification while eliminating common ableist language, builds an inclusive culture for everyone. Our language is essential to the culture we build within our libraries and archives, not only for our patrons, but also for our library workers. If we want our libraries to be accessible workplaces and inclusive of all patrons, we must adjust our language to be anti-ableist through acknowledging and respecting the reality of disability. Remember, disability does not exist in a silo, and neither should our inclusion and diversity efforts. Disability intersects with other marginalized identities, as ableism may be, and often is, imbued with racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia, or transphobia. This is because ableism is a key pillar of white supremacist culture, and when we work to dismantle it within our libraries, we move a step closer to actual equity and inclusion. Thank you for everyone for attending Disability is Not a Bad Word. We're happy to answer any questions you have. Otherwise, we ask you to reflect and share your thoughts on the following disability or discussion questions. What about the presentation surprised you? How have you been using inaccessible language? How can you or your library incorporate accessible language into current or future programming, outreach, etc.? And what other ideas do you have for making libraries and archives more accessible to disabled staff and patrons?
Thank you. That was excellent. So we do have questions coming in the chat. So if you have a question, feel free to add in the chat. We'll try to get through as many as we can. We're doing really well on time though, so I think we can. The first one is, where is the quote, "Nothing about us without us"? What is that from?
So it started as a phrase that came out of actually South Africa disability rights movement, and it's something that has grown to be kind of a standard phrase throughout disability rights movements, both in the United States and internationally. There's a book that's called "Nothing About Us Without Us" that covers history of disability rights movements. There's like a Wikipedia page that'll tell you more about it too. But it started in South Africa and kind of spread with international disability rights efforts.
Okay. As disabled librarians and people in the workforce, how have your disabilities influenced your career, such as workplace attitude, interpersonality, and physically, if applicable?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Yeah, I'll start with this one.
You can go and then I'll go.
I saw this come in and I loved it. So thank you for asking this question. So as a disabled person, it has 100, like my entire career is influenced by my disability. As you like today, all of my research is around disabilities, inclusion, particularly interested in understanding like instruction through CRIP time. So like how we kind of modify time as disabled people, or not modify, but experience time as disabled people, and how that impacts our work through instruction and stuff like that. But also I saw you mention like interpersonally and physically. Interpersonally, I mean, we've kind of built a disabled community, or like a disabled librarian community. So we run a Discord server with a bunch of disabled librarians, and it's been really cool because that's where I've met a lot of other people who have similar research interests or similar disabilities. And like, it's just been a really great place to find community. And so it's really kind of become like my entire career in a good way. So that's part of it. And then thinking about physically, like I also mentioned that I was dynamically disabled, and that's because I have palindromic rheumatoid arthritis. And so like traveling for conferences is really terrible on my body. So I've had to like really plan about like how I do conferences, like how long am I sitting? Will I get stiff? Will I be able to move my hips and my knees afterward? Do I have time to take a day off if I want to go to a conference and stuff like that? So it really does impact like how I navigate my job physically, but like the good part is like all of the cool people that I have met and research I get to do to talk about this.
Similarly, much of my work in libraries is focused on this. Also, as someone who is tenure track, I have to do scholarship and research, so I have a lot of it, and it's pretty much all focused on disability in some way. I have an article coming out next month in College and Research Libraries with some fellow disabled researchers on the experience of academic disabled librarians. I present frequently state and national about a variety of disability topics. There's something else that I was going to say, but now I don't remember what it was. But physically, I have navigated the accommodations process a number of times, and it is far more complex than it seems, and very difficult to be successful in. I've had a lot of issues with doing it at my current workplace, and have written about that before. And I now present on how to understand the accommodations process because it's been so difficult to successfully navigate. And because I have chronic pain and fatigue, one of my accommodations is working from home part of the time. So 50% of my job duties I can do from home. But it was very difficult to actually attain those accommodations. And interpersonally, it's interesting because I went into my current role. This is my third year at my current job. When I interviewed for it, I was open about being disabled. I had already started doing disability research, and presenting about disability, and because again, I was a tenure track position, I had to talk about my scholarship, so I was very open with it. So all my colleagues knew going in, and despite that fact, because I am high risk for COVID complications, and have added another chronic illness from my one COVID infection, I have been largely left out a lot of the social aspects at my workplace because I was not safely able to eat together indoors every week. So interpersonally while we do have a very vibrant online community, we started as Twitter chat, CryptLib, and now we have primarily Discord. Interpersonally, even despite my colleagues knowing this, me being very open about all of this, I still, largely unintentionally, but still get left out a lot of the social aspects because I don't fit into the norm.
All right. Do you have any ideas on how to disclose invisible disabilities to coworkers without making it sound self-serving?
So first of all, I just want to say you don't have to.
That's what I was going to say.
And unless you want to tell these people for some specific reason, there's no need to. Okay. So don't feel like you have to. The way, by and large, especially from my research too, by and large, most people do it when they become friends with their coworkers, like through more like friendship sort of relationships when you're talking about your life. Beyond that, I would say if you're going to disclose to coworkers related to a work issue, you like a project or something like that, you would need to start with your supervisor and making sure that like if you need accommodations on something like a project, that you go that route instead of talking to your colleague. Because unfortunately, I would not be worried about being self-serving. I would be worried about potential repercussions, whether socially or professionally, from disclosure. This sounds kind of harsh, but like if it's not like a friendship thing, and if it's something about an actual work assignment, then I would recommend going through like an official route in terms of disclosing, because you have no idea how colleagues will react, and it could be not nice.
I would just also like to add, everything that you said was wonderful. I think the one thing that I would add though, is if you are doing it in more of a like friendship, like camaraderie way, it's fine to be a little like self-serving. Like I don't actually think that's self-serving, but it's fine to be a little selfish. Sometimes self-care is prioritizing yourself and your needs, and that's going to be like, that's really important. So I wouldn't say that there's like, that it's necessarily bad if it in that moment it feels a little self-serving or a little like self-centered, like you deserve that. But definitely, again, that really more only applies like if you want to have that like relationship aspect, like in a friend way. If it's work related, I would probably also recommend going a more direct and like documentable route through your supervisor or HR.
All right. So this starts with a statement and a question. I realized in the middle of an instruction section that I referred to something as a crutch, which seems ableist. I was speaking with future education educators. I asked the professor if it was ableist. He could not give me an answer. Is referring to something as a crutch ableist? If so, do you have suggestions for alternatives?
So like we talked about, like, we don't want to kind of like going back a little bit, we don't want to think of accessibility aids as a negative thing. And that's what that kind of does, right? So like many people will use crutches or walking sticks, which is in a very positive experience in their life. Okay. So I'm assuming the professor is not steeped in disability culture as much as Brea and I are, that would know that answer, that yes, we would consider that ableist, because you're using a disability term in a negative way. Okay, so think of it that way. When you're thinking about if something's ableist, think of it, are you doing something that is normal for a person with disability and inherently assuming it's negative? And in terms of alternative, I think it depends on how you're using it, like what you actually mean by it.
Yeah, I agree. Because I think, oh, the question disappeared. I couldn't remember exactly how it was phrased, but I mean, yeah, I think you could come up with other words like it's a tool, or to hold something up. I mean, like it's really, sometimes it's like just saying what you're trying to say without saying it. Like you're using these euphemisms because you're dancing around other words you don't want to say, and just saying those words are probably like just being a little bit more direct might actually be beneficial to you in that regards of like avoiding ableist language.
Yeah, like if you're using a crutch, like if you mean it like it's hindering a person's ability to do X, Y, and Z, or it's holding them back from doing something, then say that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the next commenter, during July, I was torn about how to incorporate a disability pride display. I struggled with what books to highlight so not to exclude or include. Any books we had on the topic of disability was not very current. Any advice moving forward on how to best be inclusive as well as mindful and respectful?
Yeah, so I would say just, I mean, updating your collection, if that's something that you have the ability to do. And then if you don't have like the ability to update your collection yourself, bringing that to the attention of the person who does. As for when you're curating your collection, I mean, just being cognizant that like multiple people experience disability. So like be very cautious that you're not just buying like white people who have disabilities or like men who have disabilities. I mean, like every marginalized group, every like experiences disability. So like just really like paying attention to what's out there and trying to be representative of all voices. There's not like a uniformed disability, like disabled voice.
Other things to look for in terms of the content of the books themselves, look for books that are by people with disabilities.
Yes.
So here's the big thing: by a person with a disability and not a person who is a parent of a child with disabilities, because that is often bad. Like the way they come out is often ends up being how much of a burden the child is. Okay, so for like a long time, kids books on autism were focused, like there's more books for like siblings of autistic kids about how hard it is to have a sibling with autism, or like the burden of autism, how it doesn't define them, things like that, than just the reality. Also a tip for like was something that's also used for other like books as well, like books with people of color, is just a person living their everyday life with a disability. So like the Matzo Ball was a romance novel that came out like 2 years ago. It's being turned into a movie, but the main character is disabled, and like that's part of the story. So is
Oh, are you thinking of Get a Life, Chloe Brown?
Yes, and that series with there's a 3-book series. It's a really popular romance novel. The main characters in the series all have a variety of disabilities. The author has the same disability I do in real life. But books that are just like regular books with people that have disability in them.
I would also say that if you think there's not a large selection of them, you're wrong. There is when you're looking for it, disability like shows up a lot in our literature and stuff like that. So if you're not seeing it, it might be that you're not used to looking for it. And so I would like really encourage you to become more familiar with it, but also like ask. My primary genre of reading is horror. There is so much disability representation in our current horror literature. So if you're like in a public library and like that's what you're currently curating, is that like our sci-fi right now? I mean, Tor.com puts out so many fantastic sci-fi and fantasy novels with like phenomenal disability reps. So there's not a shortness of books out there right now. It just might not be that you're looking where they're at per se.
Well, I love 4, so.
Yeah.
All right, next one. I've been in several places where person first language is presented as the only correct language to use. Do you have suggestions for how to give more nuance to that kind of guidance in the moment?
There is a resource in our resource page. It's it's disability style guide. It's like a journalism disability style guide, and it explains it like well in a concise manner. And there's some other resources on there too that explain the difference between person first and identity first. And basically, person first, outside of the so like people with intellectual disabilities prefer person first, but by and large, that language is coming from non-disabled people. So an easy way to respond is that actually and you can like easily find this on social media, disability communities on social media, TikTok, Twitter. There's things written, especially about like people in the autism community, that like people with autism or people with disabilities, what they actually prefer is identity first. So an easy way to just combat that is like, you can say the disabled people that I know personally prefer this. And I've seen people describe it as, this isn't like a tweet, so it's short, but like disability is a part of them. It's not a purse that they carry with them and that they can put down because they can't put it down. So it's not with them because they can't get rid of it. It's part of them. Brea, do you have anything else to help with that? Because it's very, people are very rigid about it. And it doesn't do anything to serve us.
Sorry, and I just saw in the chat, Claire had asked what website I was talking about. So Tor.com is actually a publishing house. So it is also the website, you can get to there, but there was a question about what website I was talking about for sci-fi books, and Tor.com is actually the publishing house. So they have a lot of fantastic science fiction, fantasy, and horror that I was referring to. But apologies for that interruption.
All right, we have lots of questions. We're going to spend all our time. This is great.
That's fine. That's why we're here.
That's wonderful. How well do you think the Library of Congress subject headings does with regards to language about disability?
I know. So I have never really done cataloging work, so I don't know very much about the subject headings, but I do know I have been asked to be part of a working group to review them because the assumption is it's not good. I'm just assuming, based on what I know about other areas of subject headings on marginalization, it is probably, and like our like cultural understanding of disability, I'm just going to assume it's abysmal.
Yeah,
but I don't know for sure.
I think that's a pretty fair assumption. I also don't do any cataloging work, and honestly, as I said in my bio, I've been in academic libraries for like a year, and Library of Congress is not what you really hear in public libraries. So that's not like my experience, but I think it's safe to assume that any of these subject headings are a bit older. They're probably not great. And I know of a few librarians from Twitter and stuff like that who are doing a lot of work to re-examine the subject headings for lots of marginalized communities. So I wouldn't assume they were great. That's kind of where I was sitting too.
I would say work on the assumption, one, that these are not created by disabled people, and two, that is not your baseline for how you should be talking about people with disabilities in your library, whether through displays or something like that.
All right. This one, how can we other librarians and libraries workers connect with y'all? So, there you go. That was very fitting to change the slide.
Well, yeah, so I found, oh, this is so sad. So for me, the best way was Twitter or X, which is really sad because it seems to be like coming to an end. I feel like a captain going down with the ship. But Katie actually put out just like a tweet into the universe, like, is anybody interested in talking about this? And that's how we connected. Like, we've never met outside of Zoom. And so that Twitter was actually a really great place for disability conversations. As I've mentioned, we do have the Discord, so feel free to reach out to Katie or I if you'd like to be a part of it. But I want to make it very clear that we only, this is only for disabled librarians. It's not for like to view if you're and like don't identify as disabled. However, we fully believe in self-identification. So as long as you identify, that's enough. And you can get in touch with us. We don't make the link public because we don't want trolls and stuff like that, but it's a very welcoming community. And then per the Discord, I've learned that a lot of librarians have moved to like Mastodon. Personally, I'm not there, so I can't speak to it, but a lot of the people who I'd met on Twitter have like migrated that way. And then I think there have been more chat, like conferences and chats around disability. So like just keep your eyes open for other people, like pop into things like this and try and network, even though that can feel awkward at times. But that's really how I've like met as much like disabled community in libraries.
Yeah, it does really suck because building a community with other disabled library folks was really foundational in me accepting myself as disabled. So it really sucks that Twitter is a garbage fire now. But Brea and I are also happy to come and speak to like your library system too. We've done that before. We're happy to have this presentation or other ones on like talking about the ADA more specifically or like other topics. We have presented to a variety of library organizations. If you think that would be helpful. Also with the Discord, by self-identification, Brea means you don't have to have a formal diagnosis. Also long COVID is under that umbrella as well.
Yes, it is.
But it's a good community space, especially because what is going to happen post Twitter is not really well known. So yeah.
And it's like a healthy mix of just like fun and life and then professional. So like you can get both just like some good memes as well as like legitimate professional development opportunities and things like that. So it's a real mixed bag, but it's a lot of fun in there.
All right. The next one is reference to the phrase crip time. Can you share how this is used properly and if it should be used in the workplace?
Yeah, okay, so I can see this question. Okay, so crip time isn't like necessarily like a thing that you're going to be like using in the workplace and stuff like that. It is a theory, and the theory is that people like disabled people experience time differently, whether that means like the way you have to plan because you have to take into like considerations like maybe you need to park in a certain place and that might take more time and or something like that, or you have to prep in the mornings for like maybe like taking time to like have a breakfast or like prepare your insulin and things like that. So like it's about creating time around all these like extra things that we have to do, but it can also be about the way that like disabled people are often infantilized and might not experience a lot of like life first, like moving out on their own, getting married, having relationships, having children at the same rate or like that like normal able-bodied people do. So it's more of like a theory than an actual like working word that you would see used a lot. That doesn't mean you can't use it. Just know that like if you're not hearing it, it's because it's more prevalent like in like academic theory than just like your everyday library conversations. And so that's why I'm really like interested in how like understanding the way we experience time as a disabled people impacts the way we're supposed to give instruction on a very like abled time scale. And that's kind of my interest of studying right now. I hope that helps.
Like pop culture, if you're on TikTok, way that you might help understand crib time is if you're on TikTok and you follow Casey Davis or Domestic Blisters, it's her TikTok account. She has ADHD and other disabilities and spends basically, she recently saw this tweet that makes me think of it, but like she is basically famous for describing disability accommodations as life hacks. And how she has hacked her life, but really she's just accommodating her disabilities. And so like all the way she adjusts her life around that, that's like kind of a pop culture way that this comes in. I see the next question about accommodations. I just want to make sure we have time to answer this quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this question is disclosure to coworkers. What about when the accommodations are very visible, but the disability is not? I work from home more often than my coworkers due to autism. I'm not sure how to explain why I'm not in the office as them. You do not have to explain anything to them unless they ask you. Like you do not feel like you need to tell them anything unless you want to. Okay. I know it might feel like you need to explain yourself. You don't. There's no legal requirement. And in fact, no one besides you can legally tell anyone that you have an accommodation. So your boss cannot say they work from home more as a disability accommodation, because that is disclosing that you have a disability. They're not allowed to do that. That's illegal. All they can do is say that, like, which is how you can approach it as well, is basically say, look, our job is to make sure everyone can do their job to the best of their abilities. And for this person, that means working from home more. So we're going to make our work environment work best for everyone. And that means that this person works from home more often. So, like, don't feel like you have to tell anybody, because you don't. And if you're comfortable doing so, you are more than welcome to, but there is no need to explain it. Hopefully that helps.
All right, and just real clarification, real quick. Brea, your email is .edu, not .ed, right?
Oh, no, it is. Thank you for catching my typo.
Okay, we got 4 minutes, so maybe we can do one more question here.
Yeah, I want to really quickly tackle the DEIA one, and then maybe we'll try and get the one above it. I don't think there's a correct way if it's DEI or DEIA, but I think the reason that we get so frustrated in the additional A is because if you're doing DEI properly, you should already be thinking about accessibility. So, like, the A is redundant if you're doing the DEI part correctly. So it's not like wrong to put the A on there, but I think our frustration is that if you have to include it, that means you weren't thinking about it when you were doing your DEI, and doing good DEI just inherently includes accessibility.
Also, the way libraries think of accessibility is garbage. Like, in the library world, accessibility means ADA compliance, and that is not disability inclusion. That is not the same thing. And so that's why I try to push. I always talk about what I do as disability inclusion and not accessibility work, because in libraries that means ADA compliance, and that's not enough.
Okay. So what do you recommend to do when admin or other staff gaslight and tone police? This is a huge issue in our organization. In previous attempts to discuss how behavior harms marginalized communities, especially disabled communities, just ends up with nothing being addressed.
So a few thoughts off the bat. I know we have about to wrap up, but one, do you have a human resources? Have they been involved? Have they been helpful? Do you have anyone who, depending how big you are, do you have someone who is like an office of compliance, like someone who is like an ADA compliance officer, or someone who is like a diversity compliance officer? If those people aren't involved, they need to be involved. And to include, like, to ensure that they are involved, you need to try to document as much as you can. Like, even if you have like a verbal conversation with someone, or like in a meeting, someone says something crappy, you need to then immediately after the meeting write it up. Okay. And if this continues to be not addressed and you go up higher, you go to HR, honestly, my recommendation would be try to leave the organization. Because there's only so much you can do as not in a position of power, unfortunately.
All right. One question, this is going to be it because we're up against time. So some states are moving away from DEI programs. Do you think those efforts will impact on accessibility initiatives?
If I remember correctly, I think I saw Derek introduce himself in the chat and said he was in Ohio, maybe. And so as a fellow Ohioan, yes, I do. I'm terrified. I think we are going to see that coming with the rest of the DEI, because I think it's all just kind of getting lumped into one thing. And so if one's going down, I think it's all going to go down, unfortunately. And I've seen some pretty scary legislation in the state currently that makes me concerned for the DEI work that we're doing. And like we've talked about, like how to kind of relabel some of our stuff because of that reason.
Also, with the current political landscape, there will likely be challenges to the ADA.
Yeah.
So there's likely going to be down the line challenges to ADA. There's going to be challenges to IDEA, which is the one for public schools. That's one of the reasons there's so much big push for privatization of education, for voucher programs, because private schools do not have to let in students with disability. So on a grander scale, like in terms of accessibility, by and large, how we do it now, being ADA compliance, is not going to be immediately changed. The biggest threat to that is going to be challenges to the ADA.
Sorry, Kansan agrees. Unfortunately, yes. So we are past time. So on behalf of everyone in today's session, Olo, Sir, and we still got almost 100 attendees. So thank you so much, everyone. We want to thank Katie and Brea. If you want to do the recordings, we will send these out once the recording's ready. You can also check the SRRT website. We also have the recordings from our previous Afternoons of Social Justices. Those are equally great. Feel free to check those out on our website. Our last section of the day will be the boycott film screening and discussion, and that will begin in about 15 minutes. So thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you so much, you too. I'm so glad we got to do it this year.
Yeah, thank you. And everybody, like, feel free to get in touch with like questions, but also like just socially while Twitter still, or X is still standing, and I'd love to connect.
I already deleted my Twitter.
Yes, thank you also. I froze briefly, but I'm also happy to answer questions. I do a lot of work on the accommodations process. So if you have more questions that you don't want to ask in a webinar, if you need assistance, help with resources, please feel free to join the CRIPLA. We have a whole section on accommodations, or you can contact me directly. I'm happy to help.
All right. Thank you.